Peter Cappers, you'll see him in that tile with his name, he, him, and pronouns. Carly Rixom's in the house. She's our executive director, watching over Ella, keeping us right there. Okay, Peter, I don't like to drag out too long, but I want to say how grateful we are to having you on board for this discussion. I think it's a great idea to start with demand response and then move it through to virtual power plants. And I think that you could explain to us, as you did to me, a little bit about the experience you started out with in New York with demand response, something they didn't necessarily fulfill 2000%. And what that really means to maybe even microgrids and to virtual power plants.
Yeah,
Welcome.
sure thing. So, hi everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to come to speak today. I'm a researcher at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, despite being with the lab for the last 18 years. I actually live in upstate New York, just outside of Syracuse. I also have solar on my home. I am not anywhere close to being net positive, unfortunately, but I do have a pretty decent sized solar array around. So yeah, what I thought would be really valuable to talk about today is I have a lot of experience in the demand response industry. It's an industry that has really grown substantially over the last 20 years. A lot of stuff precedes it. I think it's worth kind of giving a little bit of history because VPP to me is just sort of the next generation of demand response. And so understanding the context of where you came from, I think is always really helpful to understand where you're going. And so in this case, I think understanding demand response, what has the experience been in the industry over the last 40 or 50 years, because that's really pretty much how old it is, actually probably 60 years, going back to the 60s itself. And what's really happened over the last 10, 15, 20 years? And what does that then say about VPPs? And, are they going to live up to the hype that exists around them? Or, are they going to potentially just sort of be it's a great opportunity, but let's maybe temper some of the enthusiasm around that. I read the DOE's VPP liftoff report today, just kind of thinking in preparation for today. And it was like, wow, this resource sounds amazing. And there's all these great examples, but they're really highlighting, I think, the best and brightest examples. And so I want to talk a little bit about maybe what has motivated some of those examples to be lifted up. What are the things that have made some of those types of examples really successful? And what does that then say about the future? So I'm planning to talk for maybe about 15 or 20 minutes. I would much rather just kind of make this a conversation. So let me give you this background, and then we can kind of open it up, hopefully, for a broader discussion with your club. I really want to just sort of be here as a resource and hopefully try and answer some questions from you. So with that as background, so back in the 1960s was really when the first demand response programs were created. They were what were called interruptible, curtailable programs. They sort of worked in slightly different ways in the sense that they were a contract between a customer, large industrial customer, and a utility, largely to allow the utility under certain circumstances to completely interrupt service to that large industrial load. And that was usually done on some sort of like, hey, I'm calling you up and letting you know in 30 seconds I will be cutting off your load completely to the facility. Or we will be curtailing certain loads on your end, and we expect you to do that within X amount of time. When it was originally envisioned, they thought about them as grid resources, but really, to be brutally honest, they were economic development engines. It was a great reason to give these large industrial customers a break on their electric bill. So, hey, for giving me, the utility, the ability to cut your load completely at 10 or 15 megawatt industrial complex, we will give you a break of 30 or 40% on your electric bill. Now, those contracts were oftentimes developed or designed in a way such that if you didn't perform, the penalties were so egregious that you had to back pay every discount you had ever been given. And so one utility, if I recall correctly, actually tried to call one of these programs. I think it was here in New York. Customer didn't respond, and the utility tried to retroactively penalize the customer. Well, customer went to the Public Service Commission, started a legal recourse, and said this is completely ridiculous. The penalty does not fit the crime. There is no way we can be held accountable for all these back discounts we got. And the PUC agreed. So it really illustrated that like these programs could be really beneficial, but there wasn't a whole lot of teeth behind them. And so they were largely viewed as these economic development engines until about the 80s. When the 80s rolled around, you started seeing pager technology and cellular technology begin to take off. And that created the ability for utilities to actually start using end uses like pool pumps and AC units for load control programs. And so they could use these very simple pager networks, inexpensive pager networks, well, at the time, relatively expensive cell phone networks to basically develop these direct load control programs. But instead of having to give these really big economic incentives, they could create relatively modest incentives and go out and run these programs. And those are really successful for the better part of about 20 years. So through the 80s and into the 90s, those direct load control programs really worked very well for utilities to really provide these sort of peak shaving programs. But to be clear, they were peak shaving programs. They really weren't interested in energy arbitrage. This wasn't about reducing, managing energy usage for cost purposes. This is really about managing the grid. We're going to call this under very extreme sort of circumstances. With the introduction of wholesale power markets in the 1990s and early 2000s, all of a sudden these demand response programs that had existed now had an opportunity seemingly to get into a market. And so you would think this would have been a real explosion in the opportunity for utilities to leverage all these resources in a wholesale market environment. Now, I happen to work for a consultancy here in upstate New York for a guy who used to be the rates manager at National Grid, which is now, used to be Niagara Mohawk. It's now National Grid. And he won the award to design, implement, and evaluate the New York ISO's demand response programs, as well as ISO New England's programs. And so I got to be around at the very beginning of this industry, which is really fascinating because what it enabled me to see, because the first time I'd been in this industry, was looking at these opportunities for demand response to come into these organized wholesale markets. But these organized wholesale markets, as they were being stood up, were, in all intents and purposes, political animals. All rules and rule changes had to go through a political process. There was a committees represented with representatives of all the different market participants. So the load side of the market got 50%, the supply side of the market got 50%. But because demand response really didn't have any representation other than on the utilities part, DR resources specifically were not represented. And so when these ISOs first opened their doors, they had the ability to potentially leverage these demand response resources, but they had to have market rules that allowed them to be in those markets. ERCOT is a great example of this, where they had a very large array of industrial curtailable load programs because of the long distances in their transmission system, and they would have very big voltage problems. And so they would oftentimes they sign these customers up to curtail them in order to maintain basically frequency and voltage on those large transmission systems. So they had these under frequency relays that would kick the load off as a way to ensure system frequency. Now, this is a resource that would have been incredibly valuable to ERCOT, but they didn't initially design the markets to integrate DR in. And so there was a pretty quick understanding of we will lose this massive resource if we don't do something about it. So in the first 3 to 6 months of ERCOT being stood up, there was a real rush to develop rules in order to allow these types of resources to come in. The New York ISO is a similar one, where they had all these old interruptible or curtailable rates that the utilities had offered, and they created a product called Special Case Resource, which was basically a capacity program that ran through their capacity market. So it was really interesting to sort of see these utility run programs really struggle to find a home in these organized wholesale markets like New York ISO, PJM, ISO New England, ERCOT, and CAISO. Now, so there's this great opportunity, but there's a challenge associated with really bringing them on when they don't have representation. So as these new rules are coming forward, and FERC is in some respects requiring that, those rules are largely being promulgated and developed by generators, because generators were clearly very interested in trying to limit the role of demand response. It potentially infringed on their supply side opportunities. It created some opportunities for market power to be mitigated, and so they weren't really enthusiastic about it. So some of the earliest programs, really, you saw them being designed in a way that really wasn't intended to promote DR, and it was a real uphill battle. Now, by the time 2, 3, 4 years gets in, FERC has really stepped in, really tried to promote demand response, really challenged ISOs, RTOs to really develop programs that will enlist a lot of customers. And so they now have generally turned to aggregators. Different states, different ISOs did this in different ways, but by and large, it was recognized in the case of a lot of ISOs that utilities were not generally interested. They didn't really want to run these programs to begin with. They were largely viewed as economic development options. But if this was truly going to be a resource, then the utilities potentially needed to really market and bring these resources to bear, and they didn't really have a big, strong interest in it. So there was a recognition on the market side that they needed to find a third-party entity to really, bring customers in. And so this is where aggregators, this was literally the inception of the aggregation market per se. Enernoc was one of the first ones. They literally won an RFP in Southwest Connecticut back in like 2003 or 4, I think. And that really started Enernoc as a juggernaut of demand response aggregators. They grew and then got bought out and grew some more, et cetera. So these aggregators really began to sort of run the market pretty quickly in these ISO arenas. And what the aggregators were able to do is something the utilities were not. In New York, at least, the regulator told the utilities, if you're going to, you need to register, if you're going to register customers for the New York ISO's DR programs, you need to pass on 90% of the benefits, 90% of the payments, performance payments that come with those programs. And you also have to levy penalties against those customers for poor performance. Now, the utilities weren't enthusiastic about running these programs to begin with, but aggregators had a very vested interest, and they weren't hamstrung by those kinds of regulations. And so what the aggregators did was said, we will take a lot more of the upfront money, but we will shield you from those penalties. And so they made a big deal about going out and saying, this is a totally riskless opportunity for you. We will bear all the risk associated with it. In fact, if they ever even told customers there was risk associated with it, but we will also take a large chunk of the payment, and we're not really going to tell you what that payment is. Just, hey, we'll give you, 10 cents a kilowatt hour. It's good enough, right? It's around what you're paying for power right now. Whereas the ISO was paying 50 cents a kilowatt hour in emergency situations. So these aggregators became very successful very fast and really began to dominate the markets in places where they existed. And so the DR opportunities that came about largely were focused on 3 different types of grid services. The DR resources were expected to provide capacity consistent with a lot of those old interruptible, curtailable type programs, as well as the direct load control programs. They also were potentially able, and so oftentimes capacity markets were built such that there was a forward element to it. You were making a commitment, and then you had to abide by that commitment. On the energy market side, there was an opportunity to potentially bid into these new day-ahead energy markets. And last but not least, there was emergency DR resources, where if the grid is imminently going to go down, we will take anything from anybody who's willing to shed load. And so those energy programs were strictly voluntary. The capacity program was really compulsory. If you signed up for it, there were expectations around the types of performance you would provide that you committed to. And on the energy side, It was up to you to decide if you were going to bid or not, but if you did, you were then going to be held accountable in the next day when you were, if you were in the day ahead market, you would say in between 12 and 1, I will reduce my load by X amount. If you somehow couldn't do that, you had to buy yourself out of that position. So it was a financial arrangement, basically. So again, aggregators were much more interested in emergency programs. It was easy money for them, absolutely no risk, and they could pay a decent amount of money, but keep an awful lot more for themselves. On the capacity side, there was a lot more risk. If customers didn't perform the way they were supposed to, could be really problematic. And so initially, these emergency DR opportunities were by far the most successful, even though there were all of these capacity-based programs, legacy sort of utility programs that could be leveraged. But those capacity DR programs took over and became the dominant program relatively quickly because of the upfront payment. That's the thing that customers really wanted, is if Enernoc or any of their other, associated folks could come forward and say, hey, I'm going to give you $100 today for your willingness to sort of curtail during these events, 10, 15, 20 events over the next 6 months. If you're willing to do that, great. And so they found a real ready supply of mostly commercial customers that wanted that upfront money in order to participate in these programs. And so capacity programs, like I said, really took off. Now, fast forward to like the mid to late 2000s, FERC begins to order ISOs to now create opportunities for demand response in ancillary services markets. Fast response, these are, needs to sort of get up to speed and provide load reductions within 15 minutes or 30 minutes, depending on the type of reserve that is being asked for, even in so much as like things like regulation services. But these are very thin markets in the sense that there's not a lot of customers, there's not a lot of generators that are providing these types of services. And for the most part, this is gravy for generators. They're already making commitments in a day ahead market to provide energy, and they oftentimes have what's called some headroom, so area above what they're being asked to produce to what the maximum amount is. And so that headroom is really just capacity that's sitting there ready to be used if the ISO were to come ask for it. And so these ancillary service markets are one that are both very thin, they're not very lucrative. And so even though FERC made a big deal about trying to create these opportunities, they just have not proven to be a market in which we've seen a lot of resources come forward. So this is sort of my first cautionary tale, I should say, when it comes to VPPs, right? Is we create these opportunities thinking that they're going to sort of manifest themselves, but there has to be a value proposition. There has to be a willingness on the part of customers to do all the things that we're asking of them in order to participate and in these types of programs. And so in these ancillary services markets, there are very, very few entities that were willing to abide by all the ISO, RTO regulations, rules, et cetera, to participate. And so it's a market that has generally kind of failed, I think, from a DR standpoint. Now, since the early 2010s, wholesale market demand response programs have not grown very much. They've really pretty much hit a peak. And that's all despite all of the efforts on the part of the demand response industry, DOE to really promote DR, FERC in terms of just continuously trying to create these new opportunities, promulgating regulation, state regulators really trying to push for demand response, especially in light of utility investments of things like advanced metering infrastructure and other things that are enabling demand response, and just the explosion of all the smart connected devices that seem like they should be ripe resources for joining these types of DR programs. And so there's a bunch of reasons that I think have very strong implications for VPP. So one, there is a very clear lack of consistent program designs across the country when it comes to demand response, especially in ISO RTOs. ISO New England and New York ISO, right next to each other, they share a transmission interface, but their capacity programs could not be more different in terms of participation requirements. Just as one example, ISO New England, if you're going to be a capacity resource, then you got to act like a generator, which means you have to submit energy bids on a day ahead basis. On the flip side, if you're in New York and you want to be a DR resource providing capacity, there's no energy market bid obligation. You simply put in some sort of strike price to say when you're willing to be dispatched. Two totally different requirements that have very different implications in terms of customers' willingness to participate in those types of programs. And if you're an aggregator, you have to now have your own infrastructure that differentiates all these rules. You have to have different marketing materials to bring customers to bear. And so you can see how with VPPs, which are oftentimes at a utility level, although with FERC 2222, obviously there's an interest in this being at the ISO RTO level as well. You still have the same problem that these VPP programs are currently designed very differently at utility level, and the opportunities for VPPs to participate in organized wholesale markets are likewise very different. And so these inconsistent program designs just create a real challenge for some of the, for anything other than the very biggest aggregators to really bring resources to bear. I think the second thing is there's a real gap in knowledge across the industry about the capabilities of the effectiveness of, in this case, demand response resources, but you can extrapolate it into VPP resources, which are even less known, have less history and less experience. So this is a really big problem. People just don't know what a VPP really is. If you ask 5 people in this industry to define a VPP, you're going to get 5 different definitions. If you look at how utilities have talked about VPPs and the programs they promulgate, again, they're all very different. And so it's unclear sort of what the efficacy of those technologies are going to look like. And there's a gap in the understanding of this. As an example, the New York ISO, the folks in the New York ISO control room were really reticent about calling on any of the emergency DR programs when the New York ISO first opened its doors. They did not think those resources would show up, and so they were damn well not going to they weren't going to avoid undertaking other actions under the assumption these DR resources would show up as expected. It took about a year or two before the system operators really truly began to count on these resources and not dispatch multiple solutions at once to solve a problem. They were willing to move to DR and only move to DR instead of DR plus other stuff as a hedging mechanism, a risk mitigation mechanism. So I think it's the same issue we're going to be facing in the utility space and the wholesale market space when it comes to VPPs of, hey, you want to manage a bunch of EV loads. How much can I really depend on those EV loads being there when I'm asking for it, when I'm calling for it, as an example? I talked about most markets really being created for generators by generators. FERC has definitely really tried over the last 25 years to move markets to be more resource agnostic. There's a lot of orders that have really tried to do that. And regulators in some respects have tried to promulgate programs, again, that are increasingly sort of technology agnostic. But it's a real challenge because a lot of the industry was sort of built around a particular model for these types of resources. And so it constantly feels like we're shoehorning something into something else. And so that has created real challenges, I think, in terms of limiting the role that demand response can play, because it just doesn't have the opportunities. The market constructs don't exist. The value opportunities to be extracted from DR just don't exist as well as they do for other resources. So again, I think it's a bit of a cautionary tale for VPPs on a going forward basis. We know that a lot of states have opted out of allowing aggregators in their state. FERC Order 745, if I recall correctly, allowed places like MISO and SPP to not. They were not required to allow aggregators. Instead, it could be just utilities that have done that. And what you oftentimes see in those markets is demand response playing a much smaller role than they do in some of the markets where aggregators are allowed. Now, if I remember correctly, if it's 222 or 2000, I don't remember which one it is, but there's a recent order that is allowing, basically said aggregators have to be allowed everywhere. 1940, I think that was the one. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Point being, there is a FERC order that is now requiring aggregators everywhere. And so that may create more opportunities for DR as well as VPPs going forward. But the role in which those aggregators play are going to be different in every single state now. And so again, if we have a lack of consistency, it creates a real challenge in terms of bringing these resources to market and finding and realizing the value opportunity that exists. We know that utilities have a very limited experience as monopolists with aggressively and successfully marketing anything. Innovation is not in their wheelhouse because they're monopolies. They don't have to innovate. You don't have to. They don't have to go out and market things to anybody. They're a one-stop shop. Everybody has to go to them. As regulators have asked utilities to do more over the last 20, 25 years, whether it's in the role of demand response, going back 30, 40 years with energy efficiency, more recently with solar, and getting involved in, utility administered solar programs or battery storage programs, right? It's taken time for utilities to figure out how to market something to a customer. I was involved in a time of use pilot where a utility in Maryland basically wanted to come forward with marketing material that said, if you're a homeowner who comes home between, at 5 o'clock and makes dinner, this is not the rate for you. There's ample evidence to suggest from all sorts of studies that that's simply not true. But that was the utility's initial perspective, and their initial bias was to just eschew this. If you're selling something, the last thing you're doing is telling people not to buy your thing. So I use it as an example, again, where in VPPs, the most successful VPPs are with utilities that have, experienced marketing things to customer. Green Mountain Power exactly is a perfect example of this. The other reason Green Mountain Power is successful relative to other utilities out there is because they have a regulatory and business model that really promotes innovation. Not a lot of states have that. And so regulators are either dragging utilities along, or they're largely letting utilities lead, and utilities just aren't leading very strongly. So there is sort of again, in the context of VPPs, utilities that have this performance-based regulatory environment have historically been much more successful at being innovative than those that have not. And so in looking at the opportunities for VPPs, they're likely going to be most successful in those places where that regulatory environment really promotes innovation. Last but not least, well, there's a couple other things then talking about things from a utility standpoint, right? A lot of the historical DR technology was reliant on interval meters to measure what was being curtailed, to measure what performance was being provided. Now, it's kind of crazy to think that advanced metering infrastructure is not ubiquitous even now. It has definitely grown over the last 10 years, but it still isn't the advanced interval digital meter is not necessarily the thing every utility has. And even those utilities that have invested in AMI have not necessarily made good on the promises that they made when those investments were made to their regulators. Almost every single utility was obligated to put in a business case to say, this is the cost of this technology, but here are all the benefits that are going to come with it. And unless a regulator held that utility accountable for those benefits, it was up to the utility to realize them, and they would then trickle down into the revenue requirement, and you would ultimately potentially reach its way to customers. Now, some regulators basically went to the utility and said, hey, you told me these would be the benefits. I am going to reduce your costs by that benefit so that your shareholder dollars are on the hook for those cost savings, not ratepayers seeing that benefit at some point down the road when you finally get around to doing those programs and really being serious about something. So this is, again, an issue of regulators potentially needing to play a very strong role in in holding utilities accountable, setting, objectives or setting goals and objectives for the utility, and creating an environment in which they can meet those goals and objectives. And if they don't, what are the consequences of doing it? Last in this utility environment is the fact that utilities have what's called a capital bias. And that's true when the cost of equity is less than the return on equity. Most utilities are getting a return on equity, investor-owned utilities are getting a return on equity in the 10 to 11% right now. Cost of equity for most of them is probably more in the 4 to 5% range. That's a huge value gap. Every dollar the utility invests is costing them 4 cents, but they're getting, 10 cents back. So they have a very strong incentive to, when there's a grid problem, to go out and invest in something, not to look at demand response, not to look at virtual power plants to solve that problem. And so regulators have to find a way to overcome that capital bias. So again, setting goals, setting objectives for participation and performance, creating, changing the regulatory paradigm into this sort of performance-driven environment are all ways in which you can potentially solve this problem or at least mitigate its effects. So in terms of where VPP has been most successful, again, I think Green Mountain Power is a perfect example, not only of regulatory leadership in creating an environment for success and innovation, but you also had a utility CEO and utility senior leadership that was really interested in innovation, really interested in delivering value to customers. And so those two things on both sides sort of came together to me in Green Mountain Power to sort of create the holy grail of everything you would want. And it's therefore, we've seen manifest VPPs, demand response, all these different innovative opportunities really, coming together in a place like Green Mountain Power. Now, cooperative utilities are a totally different animal from investor-owned utilities. That's where you oftentimes see these types of programs being more successful, demand response or VPPs, because they are ratepayer owned. You are all the people that are participating in that utility effectively are small owners of it. So the low-hanging fruit that's going to dramatically reduce prices, the types of VPPs or demand response programs that can be stood up on a relatively modest budget in a relatively quick fashion, co-ops love those types of opportunities. Now, they aren't going to go deeper, or they may be a lot less likely to go deeper because the investments are much larger. The types of control technology the utility has to invest in are dramatically larger. They may need to enlist aggregators to get more involved. And the payoff on those in terms of grid benefits may take a lot longer to inure. And so co-ops are really reticent about those types of long-term things. They're much more interested in sort of short-term opportunities. Rate increases are a real big challenge to co-ops. Or even if they're temporary, selling them to their members is a real concern. So last but not least, I think this idea of metering, certain technologies have metering inherently in them. Electric vehicles, battery storage, right? These are things that are both connected and measured by the entity that potentially sold them. And so it creates an opportunity to potentially circumvent the utilities meter and no longer need the utilities meter as a way to measure performance. And so I think it's a unique element that the broader VPP concept has, that it's really leveraging that connectedness and the measurement capabilities of the technology that exist. I also think that I think this is maybe the last thing to say, is that the current environment that our industry finds itself in is very different than it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. Demand response can and is perfectly willing and able to play a role in reducing utility costs, whether it's long-term planning expenditures or operating expenses, in the moment. But that's only useful if that demand response is in an environment where a utility is really looking to cut costs. And again, if it's really focused on capital investment, it may not want to be doing that. And if rates are going up relatively modestly, and I'm making some additional investment as a utility, I'm really not going to be focused on these other technologies, these other approaches to mitigate capital investment. The current environment is very different. We're talking about data centers and large loads coming on that are going to increase the demand for electricity by 20 or 30% within a handful of years. The amount of capital investment necessary to just manage large loads, data centers, hyperscalers, is going to be a big strain on rates. As much as I like solar, and I know you all do too, we know that the introduction of large scale renewable resources is causing integration challenges. It is potentially requiring additional transmission investment to move the power, the renewable power, from where it's generated to where it's ultimately going to be consumed. All of those public policy decisions and broader, all the benefits that come from it, nonetheless, have the potential to put a pretty sizable strain on rates. And so we're in an environment where as a regulator, anything they can do, anything they can promote to reduce rates or at least reduce the rate of growth of retail rates is going to be on their radar. Similarly, although utilities love all the new capital investment, they also know that there is only a limited appetite for it. And at some point, rate increases are just unsustainable from a public pressure standpoint. Go over and look at Puerto Rico. Go look at the US Virgin Islands. They have their own problems, but they have literally bankrupted their utilities because they're unwilling to let rates go higher than as high as they need to be, because they feel like customers can't pay for it. So I think this is an environment in which VPPs, among other demand side technologies, is an opportunity to really leverage them that hasn't existed before. And so I think it's a great time to sort of look at the past and say how much of that past is really genuinely applicable today versus what are the conditions that exist today and how is that going to affect things moving forward. So I think there's cause for optimism, in my opinion, in terms of VPP not necessarily befalling all of the problems that demand response has that preceded it. But I also think it's worth tempering some of the enthusiasm around VPP because there are some structural things that I think still need to get addressed. All right,
Thank
I've
you
talked
very
way too long. I think I said I want to talk for 15 minutes. I looked down, it's now
much. I told you it was
6:40.
going to go on longer.
Sorry about that. All right, do we want to open it up to questions?
So
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. I don't know how this group works their questions. Use a raise hand function or what?
Ella, I'll leave it to you because it looks like Wilden's on maybe offline all of a sudden.
That's totally fine. Yeah, feel free to ask your questions away and yeah, go for it.
So one of the first things, so in terms of your virtual power plants, if I understood everything, and then I've also had some previous discussions with people, because of the rapid growth in power, and you talked about how capital intensive that would going to be, but there was also a thought that even if we could build central power plants, there's not enough time to meet the demand. So then as I heard this, I reflected on my situation. So in 2024 in Michigan, when the sun doesn't shine in December, I'm 2.9 megawatts positive to DTE, the local utility here.
Yep.
And as I look at it, in one of the previous discussions, somebody said, we don't have the metrics to drive this set up correctly. To my way of thinking, if they paid residents, municipalities, and industry the same rate of return that they pay on capital investments, then you have a chance, maybe, I'm not sure there are enough solar panels or wind turbines that could be built either, but you also would seem to me not to fight the distribution problem. So is there any movement? I mean, if you look at it right now, I generate power. They pay me, 8 cents a kilowatt hour. They charge my neighbor 16 cents a kilowatt hour in rough numbers. So they're making 8 cents a kilowatt hour and they've invested no capital. So they ought to give me the whole 16 cents kilowatt hour. They started doing that across the market. They would probably have the financial incentive to set up a virtual power plant that's distributed generation. Any chance of that?
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about utility rates and rate design, because I think this is a really critical thing to understand, right? So utilities are largely I think in a lot of places, most utilities are anywhere between like 50 to 70% of their costs are sunk, meaning we've invested all of this capital, poles, wires, transformers, substations, ultimately generators if you're, vertically integrated. We have just an inordinate amount of fixed or sunk costs, right? And so the things that are variable are relatively small. So to your point, you injecting power back on the grid, it's not worth 16 cents because 8 to 12 cents of that rate is tied up in just fixed cost that the utility has to repay on. So that's one of the reasons why utilities have turned around and said, look, I shouldn't be giving you, a customer who injects power back on the grid, 16 cents, because I still have all these fixed costs that I have to pay for. You're connected to the grid, you're relying on the grid, and so you need to sort of pay your share of it. Now, we can argue about it at the margin when you are injecting power back on and the conditions in which you're injecting power back on. Maybe a flat 8 cents does not make sense, and I totally agree with that. Having a variable rate that reflects the true cost of power. Are you helping are you as a resource helping to manage the distribution system?
Yes.
Such that we can avoid future capital investments. Well, that should be worth something. Likewise, if what you are doing today is helping to avoid transmission system investments or generation investments, then yes, we do need to reflect that. But I always think it's important to bring back the idea that these utilities have fixed costs that have to get repaid. And if you don't allow that, they go bankrupt, and that's a problem. Now, there's ways to balance that, but I just think it's a really important thing to understand in terms of talking about I don't think a purely distributed model in the current context of the industry works, which is sort of what you were talking about. I was like, hey, let's just all sort of do VPPs, right? I don't think that's really I don't think that's likely the direction things will go in because of all these sunken fixed costs. What do you do with all that stuff?
Well, you
So I
don't
think
have
it's
to
going
give them a return. Don't have to give them a return at 10%. You give them a
right.
return at 6%.
So exactly. So I think that's the point, is that you need to make some more fundamental, maybe financial changes to, so that the incentives for investing in your own stuff versus, pursuing other non-utility investments need to be on par with each other. But that's a going forward thing, right?
Yeah.
And that's so
exactly.
I don't disagree with you from that standpoint, but like I said, I do think it is really important to understand those sunk costs, and that those kind of need to be paid off or the utility becomes insolvent.
Okay, one other sort of point of information. I'm on a dynamic peak pricing, so I charge my 45 kilowatt hours of batteries in the wintertime at night, run the house on the batteries during the day. And I do the opposite in the summer. And with all this dynamic peak pricing and distributed generation, DTE only has 13 of us, the last I knew, in their customer base in the Detroit area. So it's unique. But I do think that the residential, municipal, industry that invests in this should have exactly the same return on investment that DTE does, and they ought to reduce DTE's return on investment.
I think that
And
would
very
help
good
legislate.
discussion.
Yeah,
Thanks, Albert.
and
Appreciate
that's
the
state by state, Albert, thank you. We are getting close to closing. Is there someone else with a burning comment and question for our speaker and also for the group?
I'm just seeing one in the chat from Drew back maybe about 20 minutes.
One of 10 or 15.
Hey, Drew, you've been active. I love it. Thank you. What's the question? Yeah.
You wrote, why should utilities pay for this service when they can simply confiscate excess solar at very low rates or simply charge minimum bills, as FPL does, while forcing ratepayers to pay for utility solar and storage?
I think that's a good question. Florida Power and Light's current utility business model does not give them any incentive really to do this. I have issues with the word confiscate, but that's a whole different, that's a tomato thing, I'm sure, in terms of how we characterize this. But I think, to me, this issue of minimum bills, I think does go back to this concept of, if you're connected to the grid and at some point you choose to rely on it, it's there, it's a backstop, and you should pay for that. There's a cost associated with having that there. And that's, to me, really what a minimum bill is supposed to represent. Now, again, in rate making, what that looks like, what costs are sort of allocated to ultimately say, this is the minimum cost of just having you connected to the grid. There's a lot of debate and discussion about if you do a totally cost basis versus if we make more strategic policy decisions about how to do that. But I think the point being that it really is incumbent on the regulator to create an environment that advocates for these types of resources to be leveraged. Because the current business model for a lot of investor-owned utilities is such that it's not really in their interest to do this, and their investors, stock price is everything. And so if this somehow adversely affects their stock price, the C-suite folks are going to hear about it and they're going to get kicked out and new, leaders come in. So I really do think regulators have a very strong role to play here in terms of creating an environment where utilities view demand side resources on par with the things that they would do, the things that they want to invest in. It's just a real uphill battle to kind of, you're facing an uphill battle if you don't have those types of, that type of an environment, because then it turns into, I've got carrots, I've got sticks, I've set goals, but like, if there's no financial incentive for the utility, we all know that unfortunately that's probably the thing that drives their behavior more than anything else. And that's just a reality of market capitalism. Again, going back to the co-op utility, like, you don't see that in co-ops. Co-ops don't have that profit incentive. And so they are really, again, a lot of those success stories you see in the VPP literature, the vast majority of them come from these co-ops. Now, they're not big programs like Green Mountain Powers, let's say. But from a numbers standpoint, I think co-ops are probably much more successful at implementing VPPs because they see them as just in their own, corporate interest, which is really their ratepayers' interests. Whereas investor-owned utilities are, unfortunately, again, they're really more interested potentially in their shareholders than they are in ratepayers. And I'm not trying to denigrate utilities. This is just the incentive structure that's been created. And again, there are great examples of investor-owned utilities who have, been really successful, but it's largely because they've fundamentally changed that business and regulatory model.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to close this part of the meeting now. I think we should say to be continued. We'd love to visit with you again in another 6 months. And I know the webinar schedule for American Solar Energy Society is a bit tight, and for the technical divisions too. And this has been extremely informative. Thank you again from the whole group.
All right, thank you. Have a good night, everyone. Cheers.
Good night.